Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, a deeply human legal puzzle. What happens when someone just vanishes? Not for a day or a week, but for years. They leave behind a family, a life, everything just frozen in time. And what happens when the law, which is all about certainty, comes face to face with the total uncertainty of a person who has simply disappeared? Okay, so let's get right into it. Imagine you have to prove someone is gone forever, but you have no body, no witnesses, not even a death certificate. It sounds impossible, right? Well, this is the exact situation one family found themselves in, and it forced the entire legal system to confront this kind of ghost and its own machinery.
So here's how we're going to walk through this. We'll start with the father's disappearance, see how the lower court initially said no, and then follow the case all the way to a landmark high court verdict that finally untangled this mess. And of course, we'll talk about why it's still so important today.
All right, let's start at the very beginning with the Shaw family. Because their story isn't just some dry legal case. It's a family's search for closure in a system that, frankly, just wasn't built for their kind of tragedy. The first thing you really need to get is the sheer amount of time that passed here. Subhas Shaw was last seen on May 2nd, 1993. His family, they did everything they could think of. They filed a missing person report, they put his photo in the newspaper, and then they just waited. 7 long years went by before the police finally officially told them, sorry, all our efforts have failed. So with no other options, his son Sudarshan did the only thing he could. He turned to the courts. So the family needed to get access to Subhas Shaw's assets, bank accounts, stocks, that kind of thing, just to be able to move on. But to do that, they ran smack into their first huge roadblock. It was a classic case of rigid legal rules just colliding with a really painful human reality. The key they needed was something called a succession certificate. On the surface, it's a pretty standard legal document. Basically, it's the court giving you a permission slip that says, yep, you're the rightful heir, you can now legally take control of this person's finances. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, not so fast. And here is where the problem started. The law for the certificate, Section 372, has a list of things you have to include. But look at the very first one, Item A. It requires the time of the death of the deceased. For the Shaw family, this was literally impossible. How on earth could they provide a time of death for someone who had just vanished? And this is exactly where their case hit a brick wall. The lower court looked at the law, saw that it required a time of death, and saw the Shaws didn't have a death certificate. So their ruling was incredibly rigid and absolute. Without that piece of paper, the case couldn't even be heard. The family was totally trapped in a legal catch-22. But Sudarshan Shaw refused to accept this bureaucratic dead end. He appealed the decision, taking his family's fight to a higher court. He was essentially asking for a ruling that was based not just on the strict letter of the law, but on basic logic and, a little compassion. And this really put the core of the legal battle into sharp focus. On one side, you had the lower court being super inflexible. The law says you need a time of death. Go file a whole separate case to declare him dead, then come back to us. But the family's argument was just pure common sense. Look, after 7 years, the law itself presumes he's dead. This court should have the power to just recognize that fact and let us move forward. So this put a really fundamental question in front of the High Court. How is the legal system supposed to handle these ghost cases? Does justice just grind to a halt when you don't have the perfect piece of paper to prove what everyone already knows is true? Can the law be flexible enough to provide a real solution for real people? To answer that question, the court had to turn to a very specific legal tool. It's a fascinating piece of law that was pretty much designed for exactly this kind of impossible situation. This is Section 108 of the Evidence Act. It's a really pragmatic, common-sense rule. It says if someone has been missing for 7 years and the people who would normally hear from them, family, friends, haven't heard a peep, then the law can just officially presume that they're dead. This was the exact tool the Shaw family was counting on. They argued that after 7 years, the law was on their side. But here's the twist, and honestly, it's the whole reason this case is so important. Section 108 creates a presumption of the fact of death. It says the person is gone, but it is completely silent on the timing of that death. The law says he is dead, but it gives you no clue when he died. And remember that number 1 requirement for the succession certificate? It needed the time of death. This tiny little legal detail was the source of the entire problem. This is where Justice Bhaskar Bhattacharya of the High Court comes in. He looked at this tangled legal knot, and instead of getting caught up in it, he just decided to untie it, using logic and a bit of historical perspective.
First, he looked back at the history of the law itself. He pointed out that the Succession Act was written way back in 1925. And back then, he said, things like death certificates and mandatory registration just weren't as common as they are today, especially in rural areas. So the law couldn't possibly have been intended to create a barrier that was impossible to overcome for people at a time when those documents often didn't even exist. Next, he made this really powerful point about what proof even means. He argued that the law doesn't say that death can only be proven with a document. A court can, and absolutely should, look at all the evidence, what people say, the circumstances of the disappearance, and then make a decision based on what's most likely to be true. And this led to the final, decisive blow against the lower court's reasoning. Justice Bhattacharya ruled that not being able to provide the exact date of death isn't fatal to the case. His finding was beautifully simple. As long as the family can provide enough evidence to convince the court that the person was dead by the time they filed their application, that's good enough. The case has to be heard. And with that, the High Court just threw out the lower court's rigid order. The case was sent back down to be judged properly, on the actual facts. The Shaw family was finally freed from their legal limbo. They were at last given a path forward. So why are we talking about this one family's story from years ago? Well, because this judgment didn't just help the Shaws. It created a really important legal precedent that had this wide ripple effect, offering hope and a practical solution for so many others. I mean, the impact of this ruling was huge. First, it established that families don't have to go through the time and money of a whole separate lawsuit just to get a missing person declared dead. The judge who's already handling the succession case can make that call. It also confirmed that evidence is more than just paperwork. People's testimony and the circumstances actually matter. But most importantly, it carved out a practical, humane, and logical path for families who are caught in that unimaginable pain of having a loved one simply disappear. And that really leaves us with a final thought. The case of Sudarshan Shaw is such a powerful reminder that justice isn't just about blindly following rules written in a book. It's about interpreting those rules with wisdom, with context, and with a real focus on the outcome for actual people. It forces us all to ask, in a world that changes so fast, how do we make sure our laws, some of them written 100 years ago, continue to deliver fairness and not just red tape?